The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Jim Tankersley, covers economic and tax policy for the New York Times. He's the author, most recently, of The Riches of This Land, the untold true story of America's middle class. Jim Tankersley, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Part of this book is retelling the rise of the middle class, and we're largely talking about the 70s. What do we get wrong about that story?
Well, so I think we get wrong in the story goes all the way back to World War II. I think that the story that, I grew up hearing and that maybe a lot of your listeners grew up hearing was a very Leave It to Beaver story. The American middle class booms in the 50s and 60s and 70s as, white suburban dads come home from their jobs with new cars in the driveway. People can buy houses. Those things happened. But the story of the middle class really is a story of expanding opportunity for people who aren't white guys coming home from their white collar jobs. It's the story of women. It's the story of black men. It's the story of immigrants. It's a story of America, which had for far too long walled off opportunity to enormous groups of people, everyone who wasn't basically an elite white guy, finally tearing down some of those barriers. And when those barriers came down and talented people were able to get into jobs they never before had access to, crazy thing happened, which was the economy grew faster and everyone did better. And that was actually the driver of the great middle class boom of the post-war era. And I think a similar type of tearing down of the walls could unleash another boom again.
What's happened to these advances for women and people of color in the economy? Have the doors stayed open?
Well, I think in a lot of ways they've started to swing shut again. And some of that is, racism and sexism are still very real and very prevalent, unfortunately, in our country. In some cases, things got worse in the 80s. Mass incarceration certainly was a real blow to the economic fortunes of black men in particular. And then also the economy has just changed and policy has not kept up. And that has created some barriers too. If we think about the share of women who work in this country was steadily rising for a long time, but it plateaued and went backwards in recent years. Even before this crisis. And the reason that we saw that in the mid-2000s, in part, is because we didn't have good childcare options for a lot of working women. And so they were forced to make these choices that, for social reasons and otherwise, working men very rarely have to make. And that is an institutional barrier to women getting ahead. So some of it is policy challenges, some of it is our own lingering institutions that continue to favor white men, and some of it is just plain and simple discrimination.
Yeah. Given how important the workers you're writing about are to the economy, what would be the reason not to finish the job and create a fully inclusive economy?
Well, I think there's two big reasons. One is that people in power don't like to give it up, and that what we've seen over time is that the elite men really who run the country have resisted in a lot of cases progress, all the way along the lines, and have gotten impatient and said, well, gee, we did civil rights, 10 years ago? That should be enough, right? When it clearly wasn't. But the second reason is that those men have sold a lie to America's workers, to the white workers in particular. And there are a large group of American workers who believe that people who don't look like them are threats to them, that immigrants or black workers or women are coming to take the jobs of white men in the industrial Midwest and elsewhere. And what the research shows is that's not true. That actually, when women and men of color and immigrants get ahead, everybody gets ahead, including working class white men. But it's a very politically advantageous story to tell. It's a story as old as the Republic, and that has been used quite effectively. And I think we live in a country where that is being deployed today.
You do write about Donald Trump in the book. And one of the points you make is that in selling himself to the so-called forgotten Americans, he perpetuates the myth that people of color and women are a threat to their jobs, much like what you just alluded to. What has been the price of this campaign?
Well, I think that the big price is that Donald Trump has taken some policy actions that have not done what he said they would do. I guess is the easy way to put it. I in my career as an economics reporter, I've spent a lot of time out with factory workers and other working class people around the country. I lived and worked in Ohio in the mid 2000s and talked to a lot of the types of folks who really believed that Donald Trump was going to make good on his promises to bring these jobs back, that tariffs and tax cuts were going to create this whooshing of jobs back to America, to paraphrase and reverse Ross Perot. But it hasn't happened. The numbers just don't lie. There has not been a surge in reshoring of jobs under Trump. The economy has not grown 4 or 5 or 6% a year like he promised. He didn't pay off the entire, federal debt like he said he would. And middle class people have done, until the pandemic, they did pretty well, but only the sort of pretty well you would expect at the end of a long expansion, and basically as well as they were doing in the final years of the Obama economy. So there has not been this transformational change brought to the economy by the president's policies that you can see in any economic evidence. And so that's the cost of pursuing them, is that he said he had a prescription that would work, and it has not delivered the results he said that it would.
We're speaking with Jim Tankersley, covers economic and tax policy for the New York Times, also the author most recently of The Riches of This Land, the Untold True Story of America's Middle Class. Jim, what kind of policies do we need now to rebuild our middle class?
Well, I think we need a lot of things, and one of the things that I think is really important to stress here is that there's not actually a single ideology that gets you to where history says we need to go as a country. You can be someone who really believes in the power of free markets and individual liberty, and you could go looking for policies that tear down the impediments that we throw up, whether it's inside companies or inside government mandates. That keep people from getting ahead, things like occupational licensing, and certainly things like mass incarceration, which the president, I think, gets real credit for signing a bill that attempts to start addressing. But you can also go the other way and say, that it's a much more robust system of government subsidized or supplied childcare would do a lot toward boosting female labor force participation and getting really talented women, to deploy their full talents in the workforce. But I actually have my really non-pat answer to this is that the biggest change we need is attitudinal. That the country needs to just sort of decide we are all going to commit to finishing the job of equality, and that if we can really tear down institutionalized racism and sexism, we're all going to get ahead. And that's not an easy that's not a 3-point plan. Oh, let's end racism and sexism. It is the great work that so many Americans have struggled for their entire lives. But it's just really important, and I think someone needs to say that it is an economic strategy as much as it is a justice strategy for us to commit ourselves again as a nation to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, looking at the political landscape and a Congress that can't seem to find the bipartisanship to address our most urgent needs, are you at all optimistic that these kinds of changes can happen?
Well, I'm a professional reporter, so I'm by nature pessimistic about the ability of politicians to do anything. But I'm also someone who has spent enough time around people and politics to recognize moments when there seems to be an important shift in the country. And I would say that has really, one such shift just this summer has given me real hope. The protest movements for racial equality across America have absolutely driven and coincided with a marked shift in white Americans in particular reckoning with racism and its legacies and wanting to do something about it. And you have to start somewhere, but it gives me hope that a growing and overwhelming now number of Americans want to start again and try to start finishing the work of civil rights. And so it's too late in coming, and certainly there's lots of reasons to worry that it may not translate into the sort of policies that would be most helpful. But it's a start, and it is a place for hope. And this is a hopeful book, and I'm at my core an optimistic person, despite being a cynical reporter. So I choose to find the hope in that and run with it.
That was a very hopeful message from a cynical reporter, I will say. So that's great, and I understand the root in pessimism. The last chapter of your book is about being a journalist in this historical moment, and I can't imagine that you ever imagined you would be covering a political and economic climate such as we're living now. Has it changed the way you do your job?
It has. I had finished the book, and then the pandemic hit, and so I went in and rewrote huge portions of it. And I confess that I don't actually remember where they all ended up, whether it's the last chapter or sprinkled through the last chapters. But what I say in there is that we're now living through the second once-in-a-lifetime economic crisis of our lifetimes, which is, crazy. That can't help but change your job. I've been a full-time economics reporter for about a decade, and to have seen two of these is just wild. It is harder for me as someone who both lives in the minutia of spreadsheets and economic research, but also very much relies on human storytelling to convey economic messages and to help people understand how the world around them is changing, and to learn myself. I mean, the book is filled with stories of workers who I've met in my time as a reporter who have taught me what the progress in the economy really looks like. And it's harder to get out and meet those people and tell those stories when we're socially distancing, during times of quarantine. It's definitely changed how I do my job, and I regret to say that it's made it much harder to get just everyday workers across America into my pieces to the degree that I want. It's okay to talk to them on the phone. It's so much better to meet them in person, and that's been hard. But I think that's something every reporter is struggling with, and that every person in America is struggling with as we cope with the social clamping down that this pandemic has brought us.
Yeah, absolutely. The name of the book, The Riches of This Land, The Untold True Story of America's Middle Class. The author, Jim Tankersley, who covers economic and tax policy for the New York Times, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jim, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and do it again soon.
I would love to. It was really fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
For generations, workers have been punished by corporate bosses for watching the clock. But now, the corporate clock is watching workers, called digital productivity monitoring. This surveillance is done by an integrated computer system including a real-time clock, camera, keyboard tracker, and algorithms to provide a second-by-second record of what each employee is doing. Jeff Bezos, boss of Amazon, pioneered use of this ticking electronic eye in his monstrous warehouses, forcing hapless, low-paid pickers to sprint down cavernous stacks of consumer stuff to fill online orders pronto. Beat the clock or be fired. Terrific policy, exclaimed taskmasters at hospital chains, banks, tech giants, newspapers, colleges, and other outfits employing millions of mid-level professionals. So they've been installing these unblinking digital snoops to watch their employees. even timing their bathroom breaks and constantly eyeing each one's pace of work. They've plugged in new software with such Orwellian names as Work Smart and Time Doctor to count workers' keystrokes and to snap pictures every 10 minutes of workers' faces and screens, recording all on digital scoreboards. You're paid only for the minutes the computers, quote, see you in action. Bosses hail the electronic minders as Fitbits of productivity, spurring workers to keep noses to the grindstone and also to instill workplace honesty. Only the whole scheme is dishonest. No employee's worthiness can be measured in keystrokes and 10-minute snapshots. This is Jim Hightower saying employees call this digital management demoralizing, toxic, and just wrong. But corporate investors are pouring billions into it. Which group do you trust to shape America's workplace?
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing or one time in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Let's start, Steve, with the big picture. We're at about 8 weeks out before Election Day, November 8. These are the midterms when the party that holds the White House usually gets shellacked in the midterms. And in fact, a couple of months ago, almost everybody was saying that because these are the classic midterms, because the economy is lagging, gas prices soaring, inflation threatening, COVID still hanging on, Biden's poll numbers tanking, that this looked like it was going to be a red wave on November 8th. Bad news for Democrats. Is that still the case?
You know, I'd say that we're now moving from shellacking to maybe just a pasting. That's a kind of a cute way of putting it. But the reality is that over the past couple of months, driven by a number of factors, which we can get into, Democratic prospects have improved modestly. And I think, whereas we describe, including in Politico's election forecast, which I manage, we describe Democrats as underdogs to retain control of the Senate and pretty heavy underdogs to win control of the House again. We now think that neither party has a significant advantage in the battle for the Senate. It is close to a coin flip. And while Republicans are still favored to win back control of the House, but probably not achieving the sorts of big margins and big majority that I think a lot of folks expected a couple of months ago. So we're in this real dogfight now for control of the Senate, particularly as we enter this final 8-week stretch between now and Election Day.
What are some of the prospects that have brought about this change?
Well, I think you can look both at the macro and micro factors that have gone into this. At the macro level, you talked about President Biden's approval rating. That's ticked up a few points. And, the rising tide kind of raises all boats. That few points may matter, especially in places,
in a state like Republicans talked at the Senate level about going after states like Colorado and Washington State. And we're going to find out some clarity in New Hampshire, a state Joe Biden won by 7 points with today's primaries. Those are the kinds of places Republicans thought that they would bring onto the map in November. And those, if Joe Biden's at 45% or 46% on election day, those are harder to get versus if he was at 40, 41, 42, which is, I think, what we were looking at a couple of months ago. Also, another macro level, the issue set that voters care about has changed because the issues facing them have changed. And one big part of that is the Supreme Court's ruling in the abortion case, doing away with federal right to an abortion that had existed for roughly 5 decades in the Dobbs case. That has changed the issue set for a lot of voters, and inflation easing somewhat has also helped. Those are attacks that we saw a lot during the summer and into the spring and into the summer about gas prices rising, consumer prices rising. We're seeing a little bit less of that as those prices have started to level off, or especially in the case of gas prices, come down quite a bit. And then there's the micro level, and we can go into some specific races, but Republicans have nominated some weak candidates in some of the races that they really needed to win, and that has endangered their chances in those contests.
So 2 months to go. It seems like it's right around the corner, but politically, would you agree 2 months is still a long time, and almost anything could happen in the next 2 months?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think, the last time we had a Democratic midterm election where Democrats were in control of at least the White House and then the Senate in 2014, we ended up spending a lot of October talking about this, what seemed like at the time, or what Republicans wanted to seem like, a burgeoning outbreak of Ebola. I don't know if you remember the Ebola midterm elections. That was something that was starting to fester a little bit in September, but really kind of reached a fever pitch in the middle of October, and became a subject of a lot of those campaigns, and even campaign advertising about the Obama administration's handling of the Ebola outbreak, which a lot of folks were worried about in October, and then not so worried about as it turned out that we didn't see more than a handful of cases in the United States. I think that there's still room in 8 weeks for there to be new issues that come to the fore. The one thing I will say, in comparing this to 2014 and even 2018, is the explosion of early and mail voting that we've seen. Yeah. This is something that was starting, well before the pandemic. States were moving to all-mail elections. Colorado and Washington State already had all-mail elections. States were expanding early voting, early in-person voting. But really 2020 and the pandemic kind of supercharged that. And a lot of states have left in place or codified in law some of the accommodations they made in 2020 for voters to either come and vote in person on less crowded days leading up to the election, or vote by mail at home to avoid appearing in person. And that means that a lot of votes are going to be cast well before November 8th. And so it's, to paraphrase or to quote the great philosopher Yogi Berra, it's getting late early. And it's going to get later earlier than we've seen in some of these historical comparisons that we're going to make to 2010 or 2014 or 2018, the last 3 midterm elections.
And one other factor, post-Labor Day, we're going to see tons of money, right, that hasn't been spent yet, pumped into these, particularly Senate and governor's races.
Yeah, we're already seeing that sort of 1 week removed from Labor Day now. Republican, especially both super PACs on both parties and at the Senate level, really ramping up their advertising now that we're out the Labor Day window and people are home and watching more TV as the weather turns. They're hoping to get their messages out there. It's a lot of money on both sides. And, the one thing that's kind of unique to this midterm election that I think a lot of folks might not have expected maybe a year ago is the relative parity, if not Democratic advantage in a lot of these races when it comes to both outside and inside money and the money that campaigns themselves have to spend. It's a ton of money. And Democrats are actually, which wasn't necessarily the case in, say, 2014,
Right.
they're able to go dollar for dollar, if not actually have an advantage in some of these key races over Republicans.
All right, so let's take a look then back at some of the different categories of races. Let's start with the House. Look, 435, you can't go through every House seat, and we don't have the time nor probably the knowledge, but the Republicans need to pick up 5, correct?
5, and, after redistricting, there are a handful of seats that are sort of theirs for the taking. In Florida, the map that Governor Ron DeSantis pushed on his state legislature basically ensures that they'll flip 2 seats there. The seats where both Stephanie Murphy and Charlie Crist are vacating, Crist to run for governor, Murphy to retire. There are a couple of other states where, Montana got a second House seat. Republicans are favored to pick up that one. So already we're 3. And, you can go state by state and find 5 for them pretty easily. And it's one reason why in our election forecast we have Republicans as likely to win back the House.
Likely to win back the House with a blowout?
I think you have to be a little less confident about the prospects of a blowout after what we've seen. Some of these polls that show Democrats doing a little bit better. What we saw in that special election in New York's Hudson Valley last month, where Democrats won a district that had only voted for Joe Biden by about 2 points. That's 2 points less than the national margin. So 2 points more Republican on the margin, at least, than the country as a whole. And that's a place where Democrats were able to hold that seat. And Republicans had they had the candidate they wanted. So I think you have to look at those and just what's been happening over the past 2 months and say that the idea of this large Republican majority that I think a lot of folks on the right were dreaming about in the spring is unlikely to come to pass. Though, again, with 8 weeks, some things can change.
So you classify right now House races, right, as likely Republican, but not by a huge margin. Is that good summation?
I think you're looking at with the evidence we have now, something consistent with a 15 to 20 seat gain pickup for Republicans. So if they have to pick up 5 seats, you're talking about a 10 to 15 seat majority. So by historical standards, that's not a large majority, no, but it is a majority. And I think some more, Joe Biden's poll numbers would have to go up further for us to feel like, the majority is more in play for Democrats to hold. And that may very well happen. That sort of thing is hard to predict.
Is there any way Democrats could hold on to the House?
I think it would require it's unlikely. I think it would require, a significant improvement in Biden's poll numbers between now and Election Day. He'd have to be up near 48, 49%. And we're not seeing that so far. Now, if we don't see this spike in gas prices that they're talking about potentially in the fall, particularly with the war in Ukraine continuing and the Russians not doing so well, that may help. That's certainly the trajectory. Biden's on an upward trajectory and Democrats are on an upward trajectory. That, though, has to continue in order for them to actually realistically start to think about keeping their House majority.
And let's move to the Senate. What is your call today on Democrats holding or maybe even increasing the number in the Senate?
I'm going to give you a giant cop-out on this answer. We have it classified as a toss-up, Senate control.
A toss-up,
after months of giving, saying it was leaning toward Republicans, the reality is that Democratic prospects have improved in states like Arizona, which we now describe as lean Democratic. Pennsylvania, they lead, though we're leaving that in our toss-up category for now. If they were to pick up a seat in Pennsylvania, that is now 51, and they can afford to lose in either Nevada or Georgia and still keep the majority, though not both, unless they also win another Republican seat in Wisconsin or North Carolina or Florida or Ohio. So it is basically close to a coin flip.
Yeah.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.